Hi, my name is Tanvir Alam and I will be presenting best practices for securing Microsoft Internet Information Server and Microsoft SQL Server. Agenda for this presentation is as follows. We'll start with a brief discussion on the purpose of Microsoft IIS Server and SQL Server. After that, we will review industry best practices for securing Microsoft IIS Server, and then we will discuss industry best practices for securing Microsoft SQL Server. For organization utilizing Microsoft stack of technologies, Internet Information Services is the most commonly used server to host web application, and SQL Server is mostly used for data storage. Due to high market capitalization, these are the platform of choice for attacker to exploit any vulnerability. Securing just one or another server is not an option. Both platforms must be secure to prevent attacker from exploiting any vulnerability. This presentation will explore industry best practices for securing these two popular platforms. Web servers are one of the most exposed and targeted systems on the network. IIS server is preferred choice for hosting application developed using Microsoft technology. IIS also provides supports for hosting application developed using other platforms through module-based approach. In this presentation, we will look into security hardening aspect of IIS in 5 categories, spanning from inceptions to implementation. These categories are planning, installation, configuration of the application hosted on this web server, and lastly, maintenance and improvement. So let's look into the planning phase of Microsoft IIS deployment from security point of view. Security must be an essential component of a web server and application hosted on it. It should be taken into consideration from the very first step of setting up web server. Adding security control at a later stage is harder and error-prone process. Number of factors and its impact on overall configuration should be taken into account during the planning phase. And some of these factors are purpose of the server. What are the security requirements from this web server? What are the authentication requirements? What are the protocol requirements? Whether the web server is going to support a secure protocol. Type of application and technology this web server is going to support. Let's discuss security hardening best practices during the installation phase. First, IIS server isolation. It is important. The server hosting IIS server should not have any other application services installed. Any exploit which compromises a web server can also compromise other application hosted on the same server. In addition, special care must be taken to not host IIS on the same server as on domain controller or the database server. Next is the IIS modules consideration. Modules in IIS are the set of building blocks to add desired functionality to the web server. Using this modular approach, a third-party application and technology can be hosted on IIS server, for example, PHP, WordPress support. Latest version of IIS support more than 40 different modules. We should carefully review and deploy only the required modules. This helps in reducing the potential attack surface area. In addition, these modules should be reviewed periodically to ensure that unwanted modules or the modules which are no longer in use are disabled or removed. Site content location also has important consideration from the security point of view. By default, site contents are located under inet folder on the root drive. It is a well-known location and a target of attacker once the machine is compromised. This should be moved to a shared network drive for separation from the operating system, ease of backup, as well as security. In addition, only the service account of IIS worker process should have access to this folder. This setting can be accessed by going into IIS Management Console and clicking on the site for which you want to move the folder. Once you click on the default site or any other site, you will click on the basic settings, and it opens up a new window where you can set the physical path where the site content should be located. In this section, we will discuss industry security hardening best practices for the configuration of IIS. IIS support for HTTP method must be carefully reviewed and disable the one which is not supported or not needed. This setting can be done either at the server level or at individual website level. My recommendation will be to start at the server level and then fine-tune at individual website level based on the individual application need. In IIS, unless an HTTP method is explicitly blocked, it is allowed by IIS. So we have to make sure that if a HTTP method is not supported, it must be listed using the deny verb functionality. It is recommended to disable options and the connect verb or the HTTP method. The options method provide a list of methods that are supported by the web server. This can be useful for attacker to formulate their attack strategy. Connect method starts two-way communication with the requested resource. It can be used to open a tunnel when client asks an HTTP proxy server to tunnel the request or to open an HTTP connection to the desired location. This setting can be accessed by going into IIS Management Console, clicking on the request filtering icon. It opens the request filtering and we need to go to HTTP verb. Using the allow verb or the deny verb in the action pane, we can list supported HTTP methods. The dynamic IP restriction module helps block requests from IP addresses that exceeds a specified number of requests or fits in a specific pattern or behavior. This module helps in preventing denial of service attack by inspecting IP addresses of each request and temporarily block IP address that follows a specific pattern. This module by default is not added to IIS server. If you want to add this module, you need to go to Windows Server, add role and feature, and deploy or add the IP and domain restriction feature. Once this feature is added, a new icon, IP address and domain restriction, will show up on the IIS Management Console. Once you double click on it, the screen on the right side show up. On the first top option, you can deny an IP address access to web server if maximum number of concurrent requests exceed the number you have configured. Or if the number of requests over a specific time period exceeds the maximum number of requests, in that case also the request from that IP address can be denied. Request filtering rule configuration module is a very important component in IIS. It helps in restricting type of HTTP request entertained by the IIS. The request filter module scans incoming requests to prevent a malicious request from reaching to server based upon the configured rule. These configurations can be applied at the server level or the individual website level. Request filter configuration is accessed by clicking on the request filter icon on the IIS Management Console. Once you go, it opens a request filtering screen, and there are a number of tabs which allow configuration of the filtering rules based on the location of information in the incoming request. For example, file name extension tabs allow which files are allowed, which type of file extensions are allowed. Hidden segments, URL, HTTP verb, headers, and query strings are the other criteria which can be used to define a filter. In addition, there are general request filter setting, which is accessed by clicking on the Edit feature setting. This controls whether to allow a file extension which is not listed on the File Extension tab, or block a request with HTTP method which is not listed on the HTTP verb tab, whether to block a request with a non-ASCII character or double quote. These requests may result in command execution vulnerability on the server if allowed. In addition, we can set the maximum length of the content URL in the query string. Custom filtering rule can be set up on the Rules tab, which can handle a specific scenario, for example, SQL command injection attack, by scanning the incoming request for any SQL-specific vulnerability. Logging configuration is very important and provide wealth of information and better understanding of the issues when things go wrong, or in the case of malicious attack. These log files should be monitored by automated monitoring tool, which can raise alert when a malicious activity is found. In addition, these log files must be backed up periodically, preferred daily, to preserve historical activity data. It is also recommended that each website hosted on IIS should be logged at separate location from the server to provide more granular control. Next, it is recommended that we should disable the directory browsing feature. In the absence of a default page or home page under a website directory, a website may display all files under the folder on the web server. It is a security risk, as a hacker not only get access to the file structure, but may get access to the file which they should not have. It is a good security practice to disable directory browsing at the server level and ensure that individual website is not overriding it. Response header hardening. The response generated from IIS can include a specific HTTP response header that an application can use to improve the security. These headers are designed to restrict modern browser from encountering vulnerability. Adoption of these headers add additional layer of protection for the user by mitigating certain type of attack and vulnerability. So let's look into some of the most commonly used secured HTTP response header. HTTP restrict transport security. This response header, when present, mandates that web browsers should only interact with application using HTTPS connection and never use plain HTTP or lower version of TLS. This helps protection against protocol downgrade attack like Poodle. X-frame options. This response header protects web application against clickjacking attack by denying rendering of the web content in the frame of third-party website. XSS protection. This response header protects against the reflective cross-site scripting attack by instructing browser to sanitize and block reflective cross-site script. X content type options. This response header prevents browser from trying to mime sniff the content type of the response away from the one declared by the server. It prevents exposure to drive-by download or malicious user uploaded content. Content security policy. This header provides protection against content injection attack like XSS, clickjacking, by defining the origin of the content the browser is allowed to load on the web page. In addition, other headers included in the response should be reviewed. Any header or headers which reveals the server detail, application, and associated version running on the server should be removed to reduce attack surface area. In this section, we will discuss industry security hardening best practices for the applications hosted on IIS. Web application hosted on IIS should be isolated from each other. Separate applications should be grouped into different sites with separate application pool assigned to each site. Application pools are used to isolate web application for better security, reliability, isolation, and performance. It provides each web application its own execution environment, and any issue in one environment does not spill on the other web application environment. IIS workers should be run with a low privilege identity. You should not run using built-in service identities such as network service, or local system. They often have administrative access on the local machine. By default, IIS application pools are run using application pool identity, a virtual account, which is a low privilege account. It can be further secured by using a group managed service account. These accounts are virtual, similar to the local virtual account, but they are defined into Active Directory. These accounts can only be used on a computer which is registered with this service account in the active domain. In addition, these accounts cannot be used for login purpose. It can only be used to running an application service. It is more secure, better managed from the centralized location. As discussed earlier, each website content must also be located separately. Configure an access control on each site route to allow access to only those accounts under which application pool process is running. Temporary folder, if used by a web application, also must be separated, and only account executing the process should have access to it. From authentication perspective, IIS support various authentication approach, and they should be carefully evaluated based on the application need. Some of the best secure hardening practices in these domains are as follows. SSL binding must be used for basic authentication. Basic authentication without SSL binding will cause credential to be sent in plain text and may be intercepted by the attacker. Window authentication must be used with extended protection turned on. With extended protection, authentication requests are bound to both service principal name and the outer transport layer security channel over which IWA authentication requests occur. If anonymous authentication is used in conjunction with the another authentication mechanism, make sure that anonymous authentication modules run last in the authentication chain. Otherwise, what will happen is if anonymous authentication is first, everybody will have access to the resource without going through the other authentication mechanism into the chain. Disable anonymous account access to server folder as well as write access to prevent file upload. SSL TLS encryption is configured at machine level, and IIS utilizes these configurations. It is recommended to disable SSL version 2, 3, TLS 1.1, and we should utilize TLS 1.2. In addition, weak cipher suite like null, DES, RC4 should be disabled as well. Next, detail IIS error page display should be disabled for remote user. This page can expose extensive amount of debugging information which may be used by attacker to exploit. A screenshot of .NET application error page or detail error page. You can see a lot of details are exposed related to application. In order to avoid that, one should set up a generic error page for the remote user. This page may include an error identifier for troubleshooting purpose. In this section, we will discuss industry security hardening best practices in the maintenance and the improvement phase. Once all the recommended security hardening solutions are implemented, it should be tested. Although manual testing is good, but there are automated tools which can scan the complete IIS configuration and provide recommendation. Security Configuration Wizard, a tool provided by Microsoft, runs various checks and provide a recommendation on boosting IIS server security. Another tool, by Microsoft Security Compliance Manager provide recommendations after running security tests and comparing IIS server configuration against the predefined template as per industry best practices and recommendations. Next, server administrators should keep up with patches. Technology is evolving at fast pace, as well as attackers coming up with new ways to compromise web server. Numerous possible attack vectors exist due to IIS technology used by application component deployed on server, as well as various configurations to make IIS work. IIS server must be kept up to date with the latest updates and security patches. All the recommendations discussed so far, if implemented correctly and properly, will result in a robust IIS configuration. In addition, security of the IIS can be further hardened by using web application firewall to shield web server from directly exposing to internet. Web application firewall should be configured on a separate proxy server, and all inbound and outbound traffic to and from IIS server is routed through the firewall. SQL Server is one of the leading platforms for data storage. Data is the most valuable asset for an organization, and it must be protected. In this section, we will look into a number of industry best practices to secure a SQL Server installation. Our discussion will span over 4 categories, spanning from planning to implementation as follows. Environment considerations, installation, configuration, followed by maintenance and improvement. In this section, we will look into SQL Server security best practices from environmental consideration perspective. Security of SQL Server starts with physically securing the hardware hosting database server. Having a SQL Server instance hardened to maximum security level is of no use if the physical location of database server is easily accessible. Proper procedure must be established to ensure that only authorized personnel have a physical access to server. In addition, production database backup file must be stored in a secure offsite location. Next, it is also very important to secure the operating system hosting the database server. An attacker can gain access to unsecure operating system and will have access to SQL Server database data as well as logs. Operating systems can be secured by keeping it up to date with latest patch and service pack. Apply least privilege account strategy for service accounts. Apply proper access control rules to restrict access to SQL Server physical files. Next, production database server should also be isolated from other applications and services. Operating system or a server hosting database should be lean with only necessary service installed and running. Unless required by the data server, it is strongly discouraged to install any other application or program or service. This approach ensures that the database servers have a smaller attack surface and do not have to worry about acquiring resource due to conflict with other programs. Another important aspect of database server isolation is the network isolation. It is recommended to put SQL Server in a restricted network segment or VLAN to control traffic accessing the server. In a production environment, only application and web server will be accessing the database server on a specific port. So a fairly restrictive network policy allowing traffic from only a web server can be implemented to prevent unauthorized connection. In this section, we will look into security best practices during SQL Server installation phase. SQL Server installation offers a large number of features, as these features are displayed in the screenshot. These features must be carefully reviewed during installation, and only components which is required should be installed. By reducing the number of components, we are basically reducing the attack surface of the SQL Server prone to potential attack. Let's talk about some of the features of SQL Server which allows a database procedure to execute operating system command or access applications installed on the server. XP command shell. allows a SQL Server procedure to execute OS level command. OLE automation procedure allows a SQL Server procedure to access application installed on the um, operating system. CLR enable allows a database procedure to execute a .NET code. Before enabling any of these features, they should be carefully reviewed and secured. SQL Server service account should be run with the low privilege identity. Do not run using built-in service identities such as network service, or local system, as sometimes they have pretty high level of access. SQL Server service account can be run using local virtual account, but it is recommended to use group manage service account. These accounts are virtual account defined in Active Directory. These accounts are low privilege service account tied to a computer on which it can be used. These accounts cannot be used for login purpose and is more secure and better managed from centralized location. This service account should be configured to have read and write permission to data, log, and backup folder for respective services. In this section, we will discuss security best practices in the configuration phase of SQL Server. SQL Server browser service responds to SQL Server discovery request on a network. It should be disabled. This will prevent advertisement of SQL Server on the network and cannot be automatically detected. A fully qualified connection string is required to establish connection to database, hence further reducing the attack surface area. Next, SQL Server by default get installed with a default TCP port of 1433. This port is well known and may be exploited by attacker. SQL Server should be reconfigured to listen to a different port. In addition, the SQL Server provide additional services, for example, reporting services, integration services, or analysis services. All these services default port should be changed to a totally different port, which is not very obvious. Next, SQL Server support 4 types of protocol. They are shared memory, TCP/IP, name pipe, and VIA. We should review this protocol and disable the one which is not used. TCP/IP and the name pipe are the most commonly used protocol used. SQL Server provides 2 authentication modes, namely Windows authentication and mixed mode. Windows authentication mode is preferred approach and is more secure because SQL Server validates the user credential using Windows Principal Token. Role-based authorization is preferred over creating credential for individual user and assigning permission on each database. Role-based authorization is more secure and it can be implemented in following steps. First, create a user security group in Active Directory for different database roles, for example, DBA or developer. Then in the SQL Server, create a new login for this newly created security group and assign database permission to this security group based on their role. When a new user requests a permission to database, user is directly added to the role which is created for that specific permission in the Active Directory. This allows a more centralized management than creating individual login and assigning permission for a specific user, which can be very confusing and error prone from security point of view. In case when a mixed mode configuration is required, SQL Server configuration must be set up to require a complex password. Next, SQL Server by default during installation creates an SA login if mixed mode authentication is enabled. This login has administrative access to databases hosted on the server. It is recommended to disable this login. If it can't be disabled, then first thing we should do is to rename it and then assign a complex password to this login. The password for this administrative account should be distributed to a very limited number of people in the DBA group. In this section, we will discuss security best practices during the maintenance and improvement phase of the SQL Server. SQL Server instances must be up to date with the latest patch. Microsoft regularly releases patch for SQL Server. Most vulnerabilities that get exploited have been known for a long time. So timely installation of security patch will prevent majority of the attack. Audit of database login is critical piece of information in the case of attack. When it is integrated into automated notification system, a repeated failed login can raise the alert, and before it becomes critical, it allows the administrator to disable the compromised user credential. Security of database backup is important. Backup has the same data as the production environment and need to be secure at the same level as the production. This can mean locking down backup directories, restricting access to the server or the storage, hosting the data, physical security of removable media, network access to backup, and reviewing who has access to perform and access backups. In addition, backup should be encrypted and must be stored at an offsite location. Next. Encryption and decryption is a costly operation. It is often recommended to encrypt the data, but encrypting whole database is not required. In addition, it may result in the latency issue. Instead, all sensitive data should be identified and encrypted. In addition, measures should be in place to encrypt data during transmission over the network. Importance of securing an IT infrastructure is hard to overstate, as we have seen in the discussion so far. Security consideration should not be an afterthought, but it should be part of every steps of IT infrastructure implementation, whether it is a web server, database, firewall. All it takes is one vulnerability to compromise the entire system. Securing a system is also not a one-time effort, but it is an ongoing effort. Danger of security breach will only increase with the current modular architecture and the complexity of an information system. Organization needs to be proactive to continuously monitor and review security plan, keep up with patches, and review existing architecture, service, software component to ensure that security requirements of all these components are being adhered to. Thank you for watching this presentation.